All right, so I'd like to officially welcome you to this follow-up community conversation to last week's presentation with Rebecca Evans, who was the sustainability planner for the city of Ithaca. My name is Monika Reifenstein, and I'm the interim executive director here at the Community Design Center of Rochester. Our theme for the series in all this year is the ideal city. So we've been exploring what it means and what's required to move our own community toward ideal. All of our speakers thus far have said that they don't think ideal exists or should be the end goal. So that is something that we have come to throughout the series. As a recap, last week, Rebecca shared the grassroots efforts that led to the Ithaca Green New Deal resolution and the city's implementation of that. For those who are unaware, over the past 3 years, Ithaca has developed the most aggressive decarbonization plan in the country, securing over $100 million in funding from private equity to execute the plan. As progress continues, it stands to serve as a blueprint for other US municipalities as we continue to grapple with the changing economy and climate. Today, we're going to be unpacking her talk and connecting the ideas and strategies that she brought up to our local context with the help of some local experts and of course, all of you attendees in the audience. Before we officially get into the conversation, I just have a few thank yous to go over. First of all, to NISCA for their ongoing support of our organization. Couldn't do what we do without them. As well as individuals in our community, a big thank you goes out to everyone on this list. We extend an invitation to any of you who value the work of the Community Design Center to learn more about how you can join our circle of community support. And a special thank you to our major sponsors of the overarching lecture series, the ESL Charitable Foundation and the Rochester Area Community Foundation, as well as our event sponsor for all of the Rebecca Evans events, who is RG&E. We also had some special support this time from Labella, and you'll notice soon that a few of our guest panelists today are representing Labella, so we'll be able to hear directly from them and everything that they do for the community. And we're grateful to all the other sponsors of our series as well. Special thanks to our exclusive media sponsor, WXXI, and to AA Rochester, who provides our professional development credits, as well as all of these folks behind the scenes who help make everything happen. So I am pleased that representatives from the Climate Solutions Accelerator and Labella Associates could join us today. You may note that we had planned to have someone from RG&E on the panel as well, but unfortunately she was unable to join us. But we are so glad for those of you who are with us. And since this is an informal conversation, I'm going to let each of you tell us a little bit about yourselves. And we can start just on the left, I suppose. So Abby, take it away.
Sure, thank you. So happy to be here. I'm Abby McHugh-Grifa, Executive Director of the Climate Solutions Accelerator. Our work focuses on catalyzing local efforts to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions and address the effects of climate change. And my colleague Kristen's here, actually, I didn't expect to see her face. But Kristen, if I forget to say anything, I invite you to chime in. And Kristen's work recently, she's put together she did most of the writing, but it was definitely a community effort, but to develop a regional climate action strategy, which we're really excited about. And think, we'd love to get out ahead of Ithaca. That would be the ultimate goal. Challenging goal, but something worth striving for. So that's me.
Thank you. And then we can move on to our Labella associate friends. Whoever wants to go first, just hop on in.
Sure, I can start. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Barbash with Labella Associates. I work in our Buffalo office. I'm representing our energy and commissioning discipline. Labella is a international architecture, engineering, consulting firm, and a lot of our work that we're proud of is in the green energy space and energy efficiency consulting.
And hi, everyone. I'm Aaron Schauger, also from Labella Associates. I'm also in our energy and commissioning group. So I work a lot on building efficiency and renewable energy projects. Some of the more recent trends we've seen in the industry lately have been electrification of buildings and the incorporation of renewable energy into district systems such as microgrids and district geothermal systems. So happy to be here.
And I'm Lucia Wu, also from Labella Associates. I serve as the Environmental Renewable Manager, focusing on siting of community solar and large-scale renewable energy systems here in New York State. And I also lead the group within our environmental division focused on climate resilience. And very happy to be here because my academic training has been all about how to adapt to climate change and how we can relate that to community benefits.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Also, can I say hi to Clam? Hi, Clam, who used to be with Labella and is drinking from what I can imagine is a gallon of water.
It's only a half gallon, only. Trying to hydrate more. It's very hot today, or it has been the last few days. So yeah, it's nice to see you guys.
Thanks for being here. Yeah, thank you all for introducing yourselves and for being here today to help us get through this conversation about electrification and climate change and energy in general. For anyone who's just joined a little later, just a reminder that this is an informal conversation. So you're all welcome to turn on video, turn on your sound to ask questions, use the raise hand feature so we know to call on you, anything like that. Just so we have maybe a bit of a general outline of why we even chose to program an event like this. In my time at the Design Center, I don't think we had a presentation specific to climate change at all. Of course, everything touches on it, but it did surprise me that it was something that we hadn't talked about lately specifically. So when we were going through our plans for the 2022 season, it did seem like something we definitely need to be talking about. It's an ever prevalent issue that is relevant to all aspects of society. And actually just this spring, a couple months ago, when the IPCC report came out that I'm sure you're all aware of, there was a follow-up article calling out the architectural industry, the built environment industry, specifically for not modernizing and really holding back inertia in this movement towards, I don't know what the correct term would be. Let's just say carbon neutrality for now. So I have this article in front of me because it has quite a few interesting statements that I'll just present to you so we have a foundation. So someone said that the sector hasn't modernized at all since the Second World War, and now the data shows that it's lagging behind all other sectors. Each gram of greenhouse gas emissions from buildings means a mistake in their design. So you can see that there's some really strong opinions about the impact of the built environment here. And I'm excited to hear from our Labella friends who are actively working in this area to see how they've been working with that. Another point that I see in this article is that basically just the way that buildings are produced, if we don't do it now, it's too late. And perhaps it's already too late, given the life cycle of the way buildings are built and the way they are renovated, and the long time range that goes between those renovations. So that's what brought us here today. And that's what I'm thinking about in terms of, okay, so as the Community Design Center of Rochester, who's actively involved in the architectural community, the urban planning community, as well as all of our community members who interact with the built environment every day, this is something that's at the forefront of my mind. So maybe we can start with any feedback to that specifically, or you can go ahead and start sharing your own key takeaways from the presentation last week, which is always really exciting to hear.
I'll go first. What struck to me was not necessarily any technical goals or necessarily the strategies, but the overall let's win this thing attitude that the city of Ithaca has, because if you go online and read about climate change, it's not great. It's everyone's saying we're too late. It's an insurmountable obstacle. And as someone who likes to have goals and be able to really hit them, for me, what's important is to have measurable goals that we can strive towards. But Rachel came right out and said, yes, we have very aggressive goals, and we're not afraid to go after them. And it's okay if we don't meet them, because what matters is that we try really hard from now until we can't anymore. So to me, that attitude was what struck me as that's inspiring. That's what we should all be trying to mimic within our own spheres of influence.
Yeah, it's like that. It's like the human psychology aspect of it, right? So if we say, oh, we need this by 2050, people are saying, okay, so we have until 2050. If we say we need it by 2030, people are like, oh, okay, like maybe we start working on it. And sure, maybe it doesn't happen until, I don't know if I'm being generous, 2035. But that's still a lot sooner than if we had only had a goal of later. So I agree with that. I think that's really a really exciting aspect, and something that makes it a really invigorated plan, something that has life.
Yeah, so I'll piggyback on that. I appreciate deeply how Ithaca has set the bar quite high, right? And that they are willing to experiment and try things that will then inform the rest of us. And yeah, I mean, we will be playing catch up in that case. And that's fantastic to have, the kind of that leader out there. In listening to the presentation, I think so I was already fairly familiar with the electrification side of what Ithaca is pursuing. And as I think was mentioned during the presentation, we've been engaged in conversations with them about how to partner specifically on some of the workforce development, opportunities, which is really exciting. But what I was less familiar with was just the history of how it came about. And that was what really kind of got me pumped up, was, just the Green New Deal as a comprehensive approach to addressing climate change, and a very community-led, community-driven approach. So to me, just hearing that backstory was really inspiring. And I think is what's going to allow Ithaca to be successful, is that the community is asking for this. The community wants this. The community is behind it. And it is going to be hard, as they acknowledged. So, but they're all kind of in it together and figuring it out together, which we could certainly emulate here.
Yeah, there were a couple points throughout the presentation where Rebecca said, oh, but we did it in the opposite direction of what people usually do. So one of the times was, as you mentioned, not being driven necessarily by the municipal goal of we need to do this by this time, but the people saying, hey, municipality, this is something that really matters to us, and these are our feelings about it, and we're not necessarily giving you all of the science behind it because we know you're just going to gloss over it, but we're scared and we care about this and we're mad. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah, sorry, Glenn.
No, that's okay. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I just wanted to, Monika opened up with the point, a criticism, if you will, of the AE industry and the built environment in general. And I kind of wanted to dwell on it a little bit. From my experience, if there's a, ABC development company is looking to build a building in upstate New York somewhere, they're concerned that, they go out to the industry and they procure the services of an architect and engineer, right? Those services are procured probably on price, maybe experience and reputation, but price has something to do with it, right? And then what they've bought is the services to build a building or design a building up to the current New York State code, right? So that design professional is not obligated to go above and beyond the energy code, nor do they probably have the budget to do so because they wanted to win the job, right? So all of these things that we're talking about that are great ideas in terms of electrification and low, no carbon buildings, they didn't buy that, right? So I guess until it were to become, you know, a regulation or you know, a part of the New York State Energy Code, I think it's going to be tough to get people to do. I mean, we're talking about the city of Ithaca as like, you know, they have the goals and they want to do that, and that's great. But until there's something that really gets everybody else kind of over that hump, they're gonna, you know, all these things may not be like at the forefront of their brain when they set out to design their building or rehab their building.
I'll piggyback off of what Mike is saying, and I think part of what Ithaca is doing is trying to set an example for the rest of the state. And so I see one of our questions in the comments is talking about you know, geothermal for new construction, and like, how are we going to evaluate that? I did want to point out that there are some NYSERDA programs, specifically the new construction program that'll, Mike was talking about, you know, engineers designing to code. That program pays for an energy consultant, like Labella is one, to go the extra mile and serve as an extension of the design team to evaluate opportunities for energy efficiency, renewable energy, specifically geothermal systems can be included. And, you know, that's a great resource that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, that we can leverage to, you know, take some of the lessons that we're learning from Ithaca and other efficient buildings across the country and the world, and apply them to the new development, so that we are, you know, all pulling in the same direction.
Yeah, and they have to seek it out, and they have to. That's one thing Labella does, is serve as the primary energy consultant for those jobs. And a lot of times it's, you know, we liaise with the existing mechanical design firm, and what they're doing in terms of mechanical electrical technologies is probably what they did on the last job, right? Because that takes them the least amount of time to design, and it represents the least risk for them. So Aaron, thank you for pointing that out. So there are programs to encourage this, and it's, I just wish they were more widely known and utilized.
So,
oh, Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, so my name's Scott Walker. I'm from a local Rochester climate tech company called Wex Energy. We have a cost-effective window retrofit, but that's really not what I wanted to talk about. Michael, you brought up a really good point about, you know, the design standards, and that's what they were hired to do, so that's what they got the job. But I actually was at a energy efficiency financing conference last week. And one of the presenters from NYSERDA actually, you know, like, put together this chart, and there's like 20 other things other than energy savings that energy efficiency projects do that drive value. This goes, you know, to occupant comfort. It's hard to put a dollar value on it, but it's true. It's lower insurance risks. There's like 20 other things. I'm happy to share this chart. But it's our jobs, I think, as, you know, construction, you know, people working construction people in the world, working with building owners, or me as an energy, you know, efficiency product, you know, provider, to push these conversations and to say, like, there's more that can be done in your buildings that drive value. Another thing that was really interesting from that conference was there was a financing company who actually does mortgages for commercial buildings and multifamily buildings, and has actually recently, in the last couple of years, started a program where you're able to add on a deep retrofit using the same financing terms as you did for your mortgage. Those mortgages that they did through that were half as likely to default as traditional mortgages that didn't do extra energy efficiency when they purchased the property. So I think, you know, one of our jobs, and it's really hard because there's the design standards, there's simple payback calculations, there's things that the industry and building owners have used for decades, you know, if not longer than that, that are typical. And it's our jobs to kind of push that envelope and to show them that there's more value than just this energy savings and the bill reduction that you might get. Because frankly, in Rochester, it's hard to sell energy efficiency in Rochester. We have a very low energy cost comparative to other places, but you get all those other benefits too. And I'd be happy to share this chart. It's really, really interesting. But I think that's one of the things we have to do in throughout, you know, Rochester, but everywhere, is to drive to help drive decision making and open people's eyes to all of the other, I'll say, like, non-energy benefits, but they do actually have dollar values that we can put on that.
So I'm going to conflate the presentation that Rebecca gave with the panel discussion that was on connections the day before, which I know that Aaron and Matt Corona from the Accelerator and the Hugh Smart Monroe campaign manager, was on that too. And I think one of the interesting things for me, kind of speaking, Scott, to your point, or kind of adjacent to your point, is that Ithaca was really driving a different narrative when it came to try and selling their process, or at least, you know, in terms of reducing natural gas use, increasing electric heating systems within buildings, in that they were trying to present this as a public health issue, more so than necessarily a financial issue or an environmental benefit issue, which generally speaking have been the two main directions that I have heard in presenting, you know, why we should be doing this work. So I think that's something that's interesting. It obviously is backed by a lot of science in terms of indoor air quality and stuff like that. So I think it'll be interesting to see whether that catches on, you know, in a world where we're coming out from a pandemic and so on and so forth, whether people engage with public health as a topic more than they do necessarily with environmental conditions. And I say that because, you know, so for people who don't know, I work for Monroe County. I'm at the Department of Environmental Services, and we are putting together a climate action plan for the county right now. And I have very little background in the climate space. My background is as a wastewater engineer, water and wastewater. So I've been learning a lot about how communities engage with specific topics, especially in the environment. And one thing that I've seen, you know, anecdotally here in Rochester is that environment tends to take a back seat in community conversations to other issues. So when you look at what's in the media, you know, what's discussed, you know, there's a lot around social issues. There's a lot around, you know, racial, economic injustice, you know, a lot of these things, which, you know, quite rightly have grabbed a lot of people's attention. But I think it doesn't serve us if we let the narrative about how climate justice, environmental justice, how these things underpin and intersect with those issues, because you're never going to be able to work out a long-term solution without addressing the fundamental pieces. So if we can move the narrative about climate change and the work that we need to do into more of those spaces where people are already talking about things like inequity, like redlining, like the issues that we've had with you know, housing and all of those kinds of things, and how low-income homeowners can't afford to do the necessary insulation and heating and cooling upgrades. And then we apply policy solutions to address those issues. I think that we can extend the narrative about why climate work is important, because it matters, because it's integrated with everything else that we see.
So if I could just piggyback on that briefly, you know, one thing that we talk about as an organization is that climate solutions can authentically multitask. Like, you know, multitasking is a thing in general in the world. Obviously, we know you can't do it. But in the case of climate solutions, you really can address all these various community concerns and address climate change at the same time. So I agree with Clem 100% that emphasizing the health benefits is key and critical, as well as the intersection with a lot of other things that people care about and that are kind of day-to-day concerns. Where it becomes challenging, I mean, it becomes challenging in lots of different ways. You know, this is a complex systemic issue that can be just hard to wrap your head around, but also that there is just a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding out there about the science, about the economics of it, about the health aspects of it. So, you know, those of us here understand a lot of that, but broader in the community, we don't see at this point that kind of widespread understanding of what climate change really means for our region, both short-term and long-term. So we definitely have some basic educating to do. And I guess I'll just leave it there. Oh, well, I wanted to briefly also address Thomas's comment in the chat, just with the challenges of navigating some of these programs that exist. That is definitely a real thing. And actually, I was at the same conference that Scott was at last week, where one point that I heard emphasized strongly was the need for access to clean energy and energy efficiency upgrades for it to be speedy and easy. And so long as it remains more difficult and more expensive in many cases to, do the eco-friendly thing, we're going to have progress stalled. So I think there's, a lot of ways that policy can certainly address that, but then there's also just regarding how programs are structured and how different service providers coordinate or don't coordinate. There's a whole lot of work to be done there. Yeah, and I could go on and on about that, but I won't.
Thank you, Abby. No, those are, thank all of you, really wonderful points being brought up. Specifically to something you said, Abby, also in that article, the critical article that I referenced earlier, they say that exactly the same thing, that it's been too difficult so far for people to just do it, and it needs to be so easy. And in the article, they actually say there should be IKEA kits for people to do this stuff. Like, they need to not have to think about it. They just need to be able to just do it. So I don't know, maybe we can put it on our list of to-dos, the IKEA climate retrofitting kit.
So I'll go back to one of your opening points, Monika, about that's slightly different from what was discussed, that Rebecca discussed. I think a lot of focus was energy usage within buildings and the effect on climate change from that. Something that I recently kind of learned more about is the effect of the use of materials and supply chains as it comes to construction of buildings, whether it's retrofitting old buildings, construction of new buildings. I saw recently a statistic saying that if you took all of the concrete production in the world and aggregated it, it would be the third largest country emitting greenhouse gases after the US and China, which I think is something that we don't necessarily talk about, because we talk about buildings as static, as they either don't exist and then they suddenly exist, but there's a whole process that goes into that, not just in the production of those buildings, but also in the deconstruction of those buildings. And I remember when I was on Connections last year, I believe, one of the callers called in and asked about, well, what's the point of me doing something local if China is, the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world? So what difference can I make? And once I started to learn more about how the whole, how interconnected the whole global supply chain is, you realize that the choices that you make local, when you aggregate those, do have an effect on the global economy. So if we choose to not source materials from overseas and be very specific about what we utilize in our products and our construction, we can have an impact on the behavior of other countries, because they are no longer then producing the things that we need. One of those things, speaking specifically to Ithaca, which is why I raised the question during the presentation, was what the connection between the city and Finger Lakes reuse is doing. So a group of us had an opportunity to go down to see Finger Lakes reuse. And one of the most interesting projects they had was they are taking deconstructed buildings, working with developers, and then taking the materials which would otherwise go to the landfill as construction and waste debris, and then finding ways to reincorporate them into the local construction economy. I think that's a really interesting thing that a lot of other communities should be trying to do, because when you look at that knock-on effect of transportation, production, the whole supply chain issue, that's one way you can really impact that, I feel.
Yeah, thank you. Kristen, I want to hop back to something that you put in the chat, the All Electric Buildings Act. Would you be able to share a little bit more about that?
Sure. So it's been passed by the Senate. It's in front of the, trying to get the Assembly to sign on. It applies only to new construction. So it's calling for an all electric building code and new construction, with a start of January 1, 2024. And then, there's only a few. So I just put there you go, the link into the bill in front. There's only a few more days to try to get some more Assembly members to co-sponsor the bill. The Assembly did have a legislative hearing on this all electric Buildings Act, and back to some points that Abby made earlier, just about the sort of misinformation about something like the All Electric Buildings Act. And so the research has shown there's, economic and health benefits to having an all electric building code, and that it's actually cheaper for new construction to build an electric building than it is for a fossil fuel building. So that's sort of like the hearing was the struggle over information about the All Electric Building Act. And so just a few more days to try to get it through the legislature for this season, or for this session. So.
And pardon my ignorance, what is involved in getting it through? Like, is there anything that like the community could do to support this effort in the next few days? Is there anything?
Thank you for asking.
I mean, this is how change happens, right? It's from the...
Yes, I will put in the chat there. So there is tons of information out there to help people call and make comments to their local legislators. So, but particularly, so Damon Meeks locally is a sponsor, and Sarah Clark locally is a sponsor. And so, I personally have been calling Bronson and Lunsford to try to get them to co-sponsor. And I can also put in the chat some, just one of those direct link emails that you can send messages, but also calling Hasty is another sort of big action that we're asking people to take. So I will put all of these easy links in the chat, and there's all sorts of social media memes if you're into that. And, you can tweet, Instagram, whatever. So yeah, we make it pretty easy for people to say, we want this. Because again, to Abby's point earlier, having decision makers hear from the community that this is action that they want to take is really important. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, NYSERDA has kind of led the way on a lot of this too. I can remember a time after Hurricane Sandy when we were looking at microgrids, and a lot of that involved natural gas fired electric generation. And thankfully, none of those projects got built with NYSERDA funding, to my knowledge. They eventually got canceled. But nowadays, so one of the things that Labella does is provide flex tech studies, which is just energy conservation studies. They don't even let us look at anything that extends the life of existing fossil fuel burning equipment. So say there's a K-12, a high school, and they want to save money on energy. Well, we can look at the building envelope, and we can look at the HVAC control system and whatever else. We cannot look at that gas-fired boiler and see if it would be better off to install a higher efficiency boiler, right? So all of that's kind of gone away. And I think what's missing is something that, at least for the retrofit industry, even if you can't get like all the way there with your next project, well, there's a lot of things you could do in between. Like you can design, if you're on a steam system, you could design for a lower temperature hot water, right? Or you can make it so that if you do on that bigger capital upgrade, if heat pumps are in your future, you can set yourself up so you don't preclude yourself from that. I'm going through that right now at a nursing home in Brooklyn. We're doing an energy project through the New York Power Authority, and it's I don't know how much well, they want to electrify their campus, right? And they have steam tunnels, and it's all aging, and it's the perfect candidate, right? So like, great, we're ready to go, and they want to do heat pumps, and they have a budget that's not going to allow us to retrofit everything. But we could at least do this in a way that, if they do a ground loop later on to serve their campus, which is ultimately the master plan, well, at least, we can take steps now so that those systems aren't incompatible, right? And there's a lot of technically some things that have to happen in between, but, we know all that by now, right? And it's pretty easy to say okay, well, at least, if you can't get the boilers out of your building on this project, make it so that you don't need them still on your next project.
No, Michael, that's a shame that NYSERD is doing that, right? Doing nothing is not the answer if you can't get all the way there. You know, that one project should be doing envelope measures, right? So when they do heat pumps or geothermal, there's less load. So now that heat pump project or that geothermal project, whatever, is going to be more cost effective. You know, you don't have to build the system as big. That's not helping the problem, right? Like we have to do something if you can't get all the way there. And I think that's, you know, one of the things about Ithaca is they talk about this electrification, but as Rachel said in her webinar, electrification was only one of the programs in that large project. It's only one project. It's a big part of it, right? But it's not the only thing that they're doing. So, you know, there's general energy efficiency for people who can't get all the way there. Like those programs still exist. They're still, you know, pushing those programs. You know, Ithaca is very unique that almost 80% of their buildings are rental buildings, many of which are single family duplexes for students, you know, because there's a lot of universities there. So, you know, those landlords, like, it doesn't matter to them. Those students are going to pay for those houses regardless, right? They're going to be there regardless. So it's a hard sell. But what can you do to make those houses a little bit better, you know, for the landlords, for the students, things like that. So, you know, electrification is great. Like I'd love to see that in Rochester, but let's not, you know, cut off our nose to spite our face here. Let's do something to make things better. It's a shame that NYSERD, I didn't know that. I know a lot of people.
It wasn't necessarily, I was kind of trying to be complimentary of NYSERD. I don't want
okay. You can be complimentary. That's fine. I'll take the other stance. I'll say it, right? Like that's disappointing that I didn't know. I work with a lot of flex tech providers in New York City, and that's actually not something that has been brought up to me. And, you know, I'm more focused on the envelope side of things. So no, that's, you know, it's a double-edged sword, right? It's like, yeah, they want you to push envelope or push electrification measures, but not even pointing out you could go to something better. So, but that's a policy thing, right? That's, you know, we can that's things that we can advocate for.
Right. I mean, they would let you study changes to the hot water system. I want to be totally clear. They wouldn't let me like replace a boiler or study the replacement of the boiler. But if there's something that I could do to the hot water system that would allow for, because the heat pump can only make 120, some 140 degrees, that I could make that change now, or at least study that impact now. They would allow for that. I just want to be clear.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, you know, following up on a few points that have been made, certainly getting properties heat pump ready, I think we're probably all in agreement that the energy efficiency work is essential as a first step before electrification. And just the technologies just plain don't work as well unless you've got that tight building envelope. So even though insulation, air sealing aren't the sexiest things in the world, we all need to be pushing them because they're very, very, very critically important. And similar to, you know, Ithaca's challenge with rental properties, we have that same challenge here in Rochester with over 50% of the housing units in the city being rental properties. And, you know, back in 2017, when the city developed their climate action plan, they called this out specifically as an issue that needs to be addressed here in Rochester. Not much progress has been made on that front. So I think there's an advocacy opportunity for us all there. And there are some very specific policy things that could happen, I'd say should happen. You know, we're quite inspired by the work that the Lead Coalition did, you know, quite a few years ago now, to address lead through incorporating specific measures in the certificate of occupancy process. And I believe there's an opportunity to do something similar with energy, but it will require investment. It will require, you know, engagement of landlords and tenants and code enforcement officers to figure out how to best design a program that works for the involved stakeholders. But that is a real critical challenge here in Rochester too that definitely needs to be addressed. I see some conversation in the chat about grid reliability, about the PSC and utility rate structure. And so I want to just pass it to my colleague Kristen again briefly, because I think we have another advocacy opportunity coming up in the short term here with RG&E's and NYSEG's next rate case. So I don't know if you want to talk at all about that. Kristen?
Sure. So just briefly, because it's hot off the press and I haven't read all of it yet. Friday they did file their next rate case for the upcoming rate plan. And I was encouraged to see that intervening in the 2019 rate case did seem to stick with them a little bit. That was our first time we had intervened in the rate case. And it's certainly not just us, there was a coalition of partners because they did have the CLCPA interwoven throughout what I have read thus far. So it is certainly on their radar. Now there's several different ways to get involved in the upcoming rate case. You could join us as interveners and we could collaborate on what that means to have a more powerful position at the table. But if you are not willing to take that leap yet, Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, there are several different opportunities for comments to the Public Service Commission, who will ultimately decide what, will be the arbiters of the rate case and what happens. And so in a rate case, it is the time that we have until the next 3-year period comes up to sort of weigh in and say, okay, we agree with what the company is doing in this aspect. They've added some energy efficiency programming, they've added some EV programming, they've added some dollars to try to make people more heat pump ready. But we still disagree with, other aspects of what they're doing. Still continuing to invest millions and millions of dollars in gas infrastructure and advertising on gas programming and things like that. So if you want to intervene, you can contact me directly and I can talk you through that process, or keep your eyes and ears out for opportunities to make public comments. Either they usually have a public hearing at least once. The last time we got them to have 2 here in Rochester, like 2 different sets of public hearings. And then also you can always make comments through the Department of Public Services webpage. And we will have all sorts of talking points and, points that we think are good for helping us meet the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and points that we think, hey, we'd really like the company to step up and do a little bit more. So that is, like I said, hot off the presses, and it will happen, over the next, well, it has to end in 11 months, but we'll be commenting before then. That's kind of the quick and dirty.
I just want to jump back to something that Abby had mentioned before. And this relates to environmental justice and the issue of rental properties versus owner-occupied properties. It's something that I've started to see in other areas too, where it's a really complicating factor where the incentives around climate action are generally funneled towards owners as opposed to renters, and how that doesn't match, or how this comes into conflict, I guess, with environmental justice goals in terms of the percentage of benefits. For example, I think it's 30% or 35% under the CLCPA supposed to go to environmental justice communities. And I think, to Abby's point, I haven't heard an awful lot about discussion of how that is going to happen. And I wonder if this group here, knowing that there's a focus on urban planning and urban construction, whether you believe that it's better to push this through an advocacy lens for the people who are impacted. It's, in other words, giving renters more rights to demand things from their landlords, as opposed to incentivizing property owners and letting the market decide by saying, oh, if I'm a landlord and I'm presenting these benefits to, people who prospective renters, that's going to attract more. And then that kind of leads then others to say, oh, if I want to be competitive, then I have to provide these benefits too. Is it one more than the other? Is it a combination of two? I'm interested in hearing what people's thoughts are on that.
I have thoughts, but I'm trying to do the 3 before me rule. So. Okay, but I'll talk. So in my opinion, a combination of sticks and carrots is probably appropriate, as well as a clear timeline like, so for example, something like the All Electric Building Act, well, that does not address rental properties specifically. That's not, specific for rental properties, but it tells the developer now what they can expect a few years down the road. And so similarly, for something like this rental property challenge, especially for retrofits, which are more challenging than new build, I believe that it would be helpful to have, now establish a policy that says, by X date, you will have to, at a minimum, have an energy audit, right? Like as the minimum in the short term. And by this date, you'll need to reach this standard. By this date, you'll need to reach this standard, all the way up to full electrification, of course. And that if you do it now, well, you can take advantage of this incentive and this incentive and this incentive. And if you wait too long, then you get, a fine or whatever it ends up being, where you can't renew your certificate of occupancy. But I think having certainty, part of the problem now is just uncertainty. No one knows what to expect 3, 5, 10 years from now. And that makes it hard to plan as a building owner, building operator, because you might not need a new heating system now. You might, so certainty, I think, would be appreciated all around. And yes, I can see my cat. Hello.
And it goes back to what I said originally. It's about showing, especially the landlords, whether it's a commercial building or a small, multifamily home. I have a rental small duplex that I own. It's showing them the greater value that these projects can bring, and it's really hard to do, and it's going to take more data. Like one of the speakers said, at his house, for example, he replaced his natural gas stove with an electric induction stove. Went to his insurance company and said, "Hey, I have a reduced fire risk. I want a insurance looked at again." And they're like, "Yeah, well, no, we don't. That's not part of ours. We're not going to do that." Well, he just reduced his risk, whatever percentage it is, he just reduced that, but there was no benefit for him to do that. Like, those are things that we have to do. We have to say to insurance companies, like, we have to look at things different. We have to look at this holistically from all different points of view. And it's hard to do, and we need more data, because it's like, this is relatively new. This stuff has been around for a long time, but the push to do this is relatively new, and that requires data. And that's for, and then we have to share the data, right? Like, Wex Energy can't start collecting stuff and not share it with the Labellas of the world. And Labella, is collecting data from their clients, and they can't, we need to share this so everybody can use this, so we can put holistic, I'll say arguments together, but holistic energy packages that go beyond that than just these energy numbers. And Abby, I think that's a great idea, like the staged incentive approach. I think that's a really cool, I think that's a really good idea. So it's a very hard thing to do, no doubt. Yeah. It's very hard.
And you talked about, assigning a value to those, green characteristics of a building, which is what, so some, developers are astute enough to utilize the NYSERDA programs, right? They ask us for data analysis, and they may even decide to take us up on our recommendations and construct it. Unfortunately, what I've seen, most of the time they're looking to capitalize on that benefit, right? So the savings from that are not passed on to the occupants. So that's, I don't know how we feel about that, but they exist, right? But it's the landlord's getting the spoils.
Honestly, even better, right? Because that makes it a better financial argument for the owner. Like, for me in my work, like, if you have a master metered building and the building owner gets all the benefit, it's actually like a much easier sale that way, to be able to say, like, you get all of this energy savings benefit. So, and then when it comes to affordable housing, then it's kind of a different conversation, right? Because then it's like, those are the people who need the reduction in energy bills the most. Those are the people who are the most energy insecure, right? So then it becomes like then it becomes a social argument of what is the right thing to do. And so it gets, again, it's another layer that gets more complicated. And financing, if affordable housing projects is, especially retrofits, is learning from last week is really difficult. To make those numbers work is really hard. And that's when it comes to, finding the right financing, mechanisms, whether it's PACE financing or, when you recapitalize on your property and you go to refinance your property, there's things that banks can do to make, these energy efficiency projects, finance at the same rate as your new mortgage is, things like that. Those are things we need to advocate for. Those things that banks need to look at because it ultimately does help them at the end of the day. It reduces their risk, and that's what banks kind of do. That's their job, right? Mitigate risk.
Lucia, I see that you want to jump in.
No, but both Mike and Scott are so good at this too. And that's what I wanted to talk about, which was, it's not like we're not doing nothing. We are taking some action to address that equity portion and for renters. So I was going to bring up our affordable housing clients who are trying to take proactive measures in order to ensure that benefits of these clean energy and energy efficiency upgrades are being made available to them. For example, Abby, you had home leasing, invited to your event, and they talked about how they were trying to do energy audits. They were trying to install EV charging stations and also have geothermals and also ground mounted solar to, power the rental units. So, yes, it's not comprehensive, but there is a multi-pronged approach here. And there is one aspect, at least affordable housing, where there are nice rate of funding, where you can try to explore some of these initiatives or measures that can come at a cost in order to make the pencil, basically make sure that the budget works to make it a reality. I also was going to bring up zoning updates that is probably needed across upstate New York in order to tackle some of the climate challenges that we do have. When it comes to decarbonization, we do find that a lot of the communities across upstate New York favor single residential family dwellings. And there isn't a lot of incentives to share a lot of the public utilities in a smart growth fashion. And I think the challenge right now is to convince the communities to push against the inertia of the decades of the currently existing single family housing zoning patterns to shift towards, let's allow accessory dwellings, let's allow multifamily housing units so that we can be more efficient about how we consume energy in our homes, where we work. So that is, I think, another challenge that we need to tackle sooner than later when it comes to working with our communities.
Yeah, I think that issue is probably even more emotionally charged than some of the other things we're talking about, because we're talking about NIMBYism here, right? So I've heard these discussions about, changing zoning codes, and I think Buffalo adopted a green code. I'd be curious to see what kind of conversations were had during that process before it was adopted, how much pushback came from, single family home owners and dwellers within the city. But yeah, it's, I've heard a lot of conversations about, people who envision these grand things that are good for everyone, but not for them and not for their neighborhood. And until you get people comfortable with that, that is going to be really hard to sell.
Oh, we know.
Somewhat related, Michelle in the chat has had a few comments related to growing misinformation that is happening, and she provided a link that people can visit. And I'm wondering if this intersects at all, Lucia, with the toolkit that you said that Labella put together for talking to people about climate change. And
no, it's just a blog post, because a lot of the times when we talk about climate change, different people have different ideas of what that means to them. And by the way, Clem, we should have an offline conversations about co-benefits of framing climate change as a public health issue.
Yeah,
I feel very passionate about it, but another time. But we don't have yet a toolkit. We do have a huge a variety of experts who can tackle this in a different manner. So like we have Aaron and Mike available to talk about energy efficiency, geothermal, right? Those are the different types of solutions that we can tackle. We also have different ways like electrical fleet, electrification. So right now we're working with our school district clients, to help them identify which areas are good for electric vehicle charging stations, because the state has committed to basically electrifying all of their school buses. And again, that's the public health portion. We want to make sure that our children are breathing less of the air pollutants. But then we also have experts who work with communities to basically deal with their flood risks. So we can help them install green infrastructure, look at their combined sewer overflow systems to see what are some of the ways that we can help minimize pollution at not only the building scale, but also at a neighborhood and community scale. So yes, there is a series of posts that we will be issuing about how we explore certain facets, but we don't yet have a comprehensive toolkit, and we'll be looking to NYSERDA for that. And you guys.
Gotcha. Thank you. We just have a minute left, and I do have closing slides, but if there's any other thoughts on how to mitigate the misinformation that's out there, I think that's a really big hurdle in this world where, facts are sometimes, questioned.
I don't know if this is a helpful thought exactly, but the amount of money that is going into these misinformation campaigns is enormous. And, as a small, humble nonprofit, it does feel like an uphill battle. Like, how are we supposed to push back against a 6-figure ad campaign? Like, I don't know. I honestly have no idea. So investment in just basic education, I do think, like NYSERDA, there's a lot I like about NYSERDA. I appreciate NYSERDA in so many ways, but some of just like the real basics and investment in community organizing and community education, a lot of those programs are like, just the level of funding does not match the scale of the challenge at all. So money, and the federal government, like I was really excited many months ago about the possibilities of what could be coming from the federal government. And there was the talk of the Civilian Climate Corps. I need to see that materialize.
Yeah, it's funny. I just got off a call before this one with a group which looks at global climate change issues, and there's a huge disconnect between the discussions that are happening at the international level and then what's happening at the local level, because they're talking about, they've got, private financiers, working on all of these policy issues that, stretch across obviously millions and millions of people across the world. But the implementation of that, like, I don't know how that trickles down, because we don't necessarily see a lot of it, here in Monroe County. We're starting to see more come from the state, and that's generally the avenues. Those are the avenues that we look for. How do you get access to those private pools of funding? Because they exist, they're out there, but how do you direct them to your cause? Like, how do you get from that level, the national level, international level, down to the local level?
Just really quick on that point, I know we're running over time, but so there's an organization in New York City called, or outside, Sustainable Westchester. They went around NYSERDA, around the state, and they went directly to Con Edison and proposed some energy efficiency programs and electrification programs directly to their utility. They went right to Con Edison. Now they have some challenges because they have a natural gas moratorium there, so Con Edison needs to do things. But there's talk about advocacy from Abby and Kristen. Can you just go directly to the source? Our source here is RG&E. Is there things that we can do directly working with them and saying, here's the project we want to do, and this is mutually beneficial for all of us. So that's the rate case. So that is an option to kind of funnel that money. And Abby, all the people we met last week, like those are the people we need to bring into these conversations, right, to help finance these projects and and get things done at a local level. Because the one thing I learned from that conference last week, money is not a problem. There is plenty of money out there to do projects. It's just getting it to here, there, wherever it needs to go.
Okay, any final thoughts from our panelists or our attendees before we officially wrap things up? Okay, I will say that I think that Ithaca's education approach, the way that Rebecca had been describing it anyway, was really good one. I particularly liked that they not only like brought the community into the conversation, but they paid them for the time that they were being educated, and then those folks spoke with their community. So it wasn't just these high and mighty or like removed individuals educating people. It was, we're going to funnel this information into these leaders, and then they on their own can then disseminate the information in a way that makes sense for those communities. And I think based on what she was discussing, it seemed to be really effective. So perhaps that is something we can pursue as well. If there are no other comments, I'll just thank you all and do some brief closing slides. So I appreciate you all joining us today. Really enjoyed the conversation and everything that we touched upon. I hope that you'll able to join us for our next event, which is the concluding event of our 2022 Reshaping Rochester lecture series. It will actually be our first in-person event since the beginning of the pandemic. So it's been really exciting to get all that planning in the works. It will be an in-person luncheon at the Memorial Art Gallery. And we are featuring Anna Musig, who is a director at GEL in San Francisco. So she will be zoomed in from San Francisco, but everybody in attendance will be live and enjoying a very tasty lunch from Brown Hound Catering. And you also get same-day museum admission with your ticket. As usual, we have a survey that'll be sent in a follow-up email to all of you, as well as the recording of today's event and an export of the chat, so you can gather all of those links and all of that information that was going back and forth. And that brings us officially to the end of our program. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, panelists, for your expertise. Thank you, audience members, for your questions and comments. I hope you all stay dry this afternoon and take care.
Thanks for having us.
Bye, everyone.